Hi, everyone. So we've practiced this a little bit, but it really helps to try to think like the teacher when you're studying. So write exam questions as if you were the teacher. You can pick a topic from your slides and design questions. They can be multiple choice, fill in the blank, or free response. Then trade them with your study partners to make a practice exam and see how you score. They can help you think about how those might be framed on the test and do better on your next exam. So chapter 19 is regulation of metabolism. We just finished digestion, which is going to be breaking down food and getting it into the body from the digestive tract. And now we're going to think about what you do with those nutrients and molecules once you get them inside your tissues. So remember that metabolism is the use of foods to make energy and to build complex chemicals. Essentially, it's all of the chemical reactions happening in your body. Catabolism is breaking things down, while anabolism is building things up. So I always remember this as anabolic steroids. Anabolic is going to be building, right? So in anabolic steroids case, it's taking a steroid in order to build muscle tissue. When we talk about basic food groups, we're talking about carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, plus vitamins and minerals. And finally, I want you to remember that the goal of metabolism is to make ATP for energy and to build needed molecules to maintain cells. So this process we talked about before in a previous chapter, right? Making ATP for energy is cell respiration, taking usually glucose and putting it into cell respiration to make ATP. That's one major part of metabolism. The other part is going to be building all the molecules we need to maintain our cells. So we mentioned metabolic rate in lab, and I'll remind you about how we measure this. So energy is measured in kilocalories or calories, and you get 9 kilocalories per gram for fat, 4 kilocalories per gram for protein and carbohydrates. You can measure metabolic rate with a calorimeter or a respirometer, and this is because food and oxygen going in gives you outputs of carbon dioxide, water, and heat. So we can measure either heat or CO2 as a proxy for the amount of calories being consumed. Metabolic rate, though, varies, and it varies based on age, gender, muscle mass, stress, height, hormones, activity, so many other different components. So there's a large variation in metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate is the total heat produced by the body. It's measured at rest when you're awake and not digesting in a warm temperature. That's your basal metabolic rate. Total metabolic rate then is all the calories used in a day. So this is going to include basal metabolic rate plus all your activities. So what can we do to these numbers to lose weight or gain weight, right? We're thinking about weight balance here and weight control. So one of the major things is to consider all these different nutrients you're intaking, right? Carbohydrates, fats, protein, water, minerals, and vitamins. And if it's an essential nutrient, it's from the diet, meaning the body can't make it, right? Our body can make some things, like some fatty acids, but we can't make everything. And so we have to be getting these essential nutrients from the diet. If it's something non-essential, it means the body can make it. And vitamins, when you think of vitamins in our diet, vitamins are used as coenzymes and they cannot be synthesized. So we can't make them, but they are required. We need them, including fat-soluble ones like A, D, E, and K, and water-soluble ones like B and C. Comparing this to minerals, minerals are inorganic. This is going to be things like calcium, magnesium, and iron. And so I want you to look up which veggies and fruits are rich in these compounds because we need these minerals for certain purposes. Okay. So you may have heard of mention of free radicals and antioxidants if you're looking at health or nutrition. And so what this really means in terms of science is that a free radical has an unpaired electron. Okay. And usually it's produced by the body, usually with an N or an O. And it can cause damage to lipids, proteins, and DNA. So one reason why this has been come up in health is that it's been hypothesized that free radicals can cause damage and promote aging, for example. So in lab experiments, we have seen free radicals damaging lipids, proteins, and DNA. It's not exactly clear how this would affect a whole functioning human body, but there is a concern about these free radicals. And so antioxidants, and the reason why we think antioxidants might be good for your health is antioxidants bind to free radicals, okay? And so they prevent them from damaging parts of the body. All right. So we're thinking about regulating metabolism. We have to think about energy reserves, right? And your body wants to maintain enough energy reserves so that it can do all the things it needs to do each day, regardless of how much food's intake. So energy reserves are things like glycogen and adipose. And eating is mostly controlled by the hypothalamus. Now, there's going to be neurotransmitters and hormones that control eating, but also remember that there's going to be psychological and social components to eating in humans as well. So primarily serotonin and norepinephrine are the neurotransmitters that are involved in hunger. And there's lots of research and theories around obesity, right? So we see that there's increased fat deposition in people over the last 100 years, particularly in the Western world. And so it's always been a question of, well, if we have these proper hunger signals and energy signals, why are we seeing increase in body size, increase in obesity in people? And so there's been a lot of research on these hormones called adipokines, which are hormones made by adipose tissue. One of which has gotten a lot of press is it's called leptin, because if it's high, it suppresses appetite, and if it's low, it promotes appetite. So people are saying, oh, if we can inject leptin, then people will have their appetite suppressed and will not gain weight. It's not so simple, turns out, but that's been a major hormone of interest. Another one is called TNF alpha, and this reduces sensitivity of insulin receptors. So we think this might have a role in diabetes that we'll get to in a little bit. Okay. So you'll recall some of these hormones from the endocrine chapter and from lab, that when you have glucose entering the bloodstream from a meal, you're going to have insulin released, okay? And that's going to cause storage of that glucose as glycogen in liver cells. In adipose tissue, that can happen as well. So insulin can promote glucose uptake and free fatty acid uptake into adipose tissue. And insulin is going to prevent the breakdown. Glucagon is going to do the opposite, right? Glucagon, growth hormone, corticosteroids, epinephrine, these are all hormones that can promote breakdown of fat so that you have more free fatty acids in your blood. On the glucose side of things, glucagon and epinephrine promote breakdown of glycogen into glucose. So we have hormones that are controlling the storage of glucose and free fatty acids, and then hormones that are controlling the breakdown of glycogen or glycerol into glucose and free fatty acids. Okay, so here's your thought. If the following items were increased, how would they affect hunger in a person? You can think theoretically, but I also want you to look up some of these. Maybe some of them you know. If you have increased blood glucose levels, is that going to make you hungry or not hungry? So I want you to stop here and go through this for blood glucose levels, blood amino acid levels, increased adipose tissue, insulin, glucagon, epinephrine, and then these ones that we mentioned in the digestive lecture. So cholecystokinin, that's CCK, distension of the stomach, and psychosocial influences. So what do you think would happen? And if you want to talk with me about that in office hours, I encourage you to come do so. Okay. So we talk about glucose. We talk about being in an absorptive or post-absorptive state, because what happens is that how your body's reacting differs based on when you've encountered that glucose. Okay. So the absorptive state of metabolism is when you're absorbing a meal. So you have an increase in blood glucose. That stimulates insulin production, inhibits glucagon production. So you have an increased insulin to glucagon ratio. And then over in the sort of state, we generally have anabolism. So when you have excess glucose, you're going to start forming things, forming glycogen, forming fat, forming protein, building molecules. You get decreased blood glucose after this happens, decreased amino acids, decreased fatty acids, and ketone bodies. All of these monomers and these smaller things are being turned into these bigger products. Compare that to the post-absorptive state. So after you've absorbed all this stuff and formed all these things, when fasting and blood glucose gets low, you have decreased insulin, increased glucagon, therefore a decreased insulin to glucagon ratio, hydrolysis then of glycogen, fat, and protein, and gluconeogenesis and ketogenesis. So this is all catabolism. So once you're fasting, you start to break things down. Okay. This causes you to increase your blood glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, and ketone bodies. And if you think about how often we eat, our body is very commonly moving between these two, right? The absorptive state and the post-absorptive state. Okay. So essentially, it's controlled by insulin in the absorptive state and promoting anabolism. Post-absorptive state is controlled by glucagon, and it's promoting breakdown, catabolism of stuff. Okay. So eventually, though, if you fast for long enough, you get excessive lipolysis, and you can get ketone bodies and ketoacidosis. And so while some people might want to lose weight and might want to break down fat quickly, this is actually not beneficial for two reasons. One is that your body tries to hang on to energy then, and so it's going to do things like decrease your activity level, increase hunger, things like that. But also, this state of ketoacidosis can be very dangerous. So it is acidosis, meaning it can change the pH of your blood and be very dangerous. So fasting and excessive lipolysis is not very good for the body and can be dangerous. Okay. So we talk about metabolism, I talk about diabetes because these are going to be essentially metabolic disorders. Okay. Type 1 diabetes is called insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. It's insulin dependent because it's dependent on insulin. I want to point out quickly here, though, that diabetes mellitus means copious urine. That's the diabetes part. And mellitus means sweet. So diabetes mellitus is copious sweet urine. They know this because doctors used to diagnose this by tasting someone's pee. If the pee tasted sweet, that meant they had a lot of sugar in there, a lot of glucose in their urine, which is a symptom of diabetes mellitus. Only about 10% of diabetics are type 1. And this is because type 1 diabetes is caused by autoimmune destruction of the beta cells of the pancreas. So that means that people cannot produce insulin. It's common, particularly if it's uncontrolled, to have ketoacidosis. And this is going to be a childhood onset, though we are seeing more cases of it onsetting in the 20s and 30s, which is a major question about autoimmune diseases. But typically this is going to be childhood onset before the age of 20. This can be treated, though, because if the person is not producing insulin, you can treat them with insulin injections or pumps. And there's some good biotechnology out now that helps people regulate their blood glucose levels with these insulin injections and pumps. Okay. So here's what a normal islet looks like. In type 1 diabetes, those autoimmune disorder is going to destroy these beta islets, and so they can no longer produce insulin. Compare this to type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is far more common. It's non-insulin dependent diabetes. So somebody would make insulin just fine, but they have a problem responding to it. So in type 2 diabetes, cells become resistant to insulin. And this is complicated. And so your book describes it as mostly due to poor diet, lack of exercise, and obesity, but we also know this is not that simple and that we're seeing increases in diabetic rates and pre-diabetic rates even as people have lower body weights. And so there's a connection between our environment, but also things like diet and exercise and just our lifestyle in terms of diabetes. It's rare for type 2 to have ketoacidosis, and we typically see onset over the age of 40, but again, this is going to vary. So you can also have this non-insulin dependent diabetes in childhood or young adulthood as well. The difficulty in treating this is that it's often prescribed to have diet and exercise, which can be difficult to do, especially if genetic factors prevent weight loss. There are some oral drugs that try to stimulate insulin sensitivity, so stimulate the insulin receptor to respond to insulin. Probably the most commonly prescribed one is one called metformin. And so this isn't so easy to treat, and people tend to have a hard time managing it. But it is possible through the combination of some of these factors. Okay. So we're seeing more and more folks that have diabetes, particularly long term. And the immediate issue with diabetes is not the concern. The concern is from long-term complications. So if you have continual high uncontrolled blood sugar, that's going to result in inflammation in blood vessels and nerves, and so you get damage to vessels and decreased circulation. You can get loss of feeling in places, and we see this most commonly happening in the feet. So we sometimes see people with uncontrolled diabetes have damaged vessels and nerves in their feet and having to have amputations and things like that. But other common side effects of diabetes can be stroke, heart disease, blurry vision or loss of vision in the eyes, and kidney failure and dialysis. So there are some dangers to this long-term trend, and I think as a medical community, we need to think about how our lifestyle and how our world now is contributing to this pretty concerning disease in so many people. Okay, so with that, I'll leave you for today, and I will see you next time.